Now, when communism collapsed in Europe exactly 25 years ago, the EU understood that it had to support the countries in the East on their path towards democracy and market economy. And after some initial hesitation, the EU decided that the best option for the support would be to promise membership to these countries. And in 1993, the EU formulated at the summit in Copenhagen its criteria for the accession of new countries. These are the famous Copenhagen criteria which underlie the enlargement process. And the first of these criteria is political reform. The EU wants institutions that can sustain democracy, the rule of law, there is respect for human rights and the protection of minorities. The second criteria is a functioning market economy that can withstand the pressures of competition from the EU market. And the third criteria is the acceptance of the EU legislation and the ability to implement this legislation. And this first criteria, the political criteria, has a special character because it's in a way it's front-loaded, because the EU decided that it would only start negotiations with new countries if the first criteria, democracy, rule of law, is already fulfilled. So it's a different character from the others, because negotiations can last for 10 years, and market economy and the ability to take the legislation on board can come later, but the political criteria has to be fulfilled at the beginning of the accession negotiations. The first time this was applied was already in 1997, when the EU started negotiations with a number of Central and Eastern European countries, but left Slovakia behind, because it was concerned about the authoritarian tendency of Mr. Mečia and decided not to start negotiations with Slovakia. 1 year later, and that was not a coincidence, Mr. Mečia was gone, Slovakia started negotiations and then joined together with the others. And this already shows that conditionality is the key concept in the enlargement process. So the EU is prepared to adjust the speed of the accession process to the progress of reforms. Now, this sounds almost neo-colonialist, but it really isn't. It's true that it's a very one-sided process. All the homework is done by one side, and basically the rules are dictated by the other side. And every year you have a report by the Commission in the autumn where the progress on the various criteria is assessed, sometimes very critical, and then the country usually has to take this advice on board, otherwise it will not move forward. But it is not neo-colonialist, because ultimately the objective is very emancipatory, because the point of the whole exercise is the membership of this country on an equal basis in the European Union. So at the end of the process, there is a big achievement to which these countries really aspire. I think altogether, from today's perspective, the big enlargements, called the Big Bang enlargement in 2004, when 8 post-communist countries and Malta and Cyprus joined, is considered a huge success. And I think with a lot of justification. If you look at world history, it hardly ever happened that the big empire, like the Soviet Empire, fell apart without serious bloodshed, lots of conflicts, and lots of suffering of people. In this case, the transition was managed very peacefully, and in the end, altogether very successfully. I think there were 3 main factors that made it a big success. The first factor is that the carrot of membership is a very, very serious carrot. It's the promise of being part of the richest and, in a way, most stable club of nations in Europe was a very, very serious promise, which, of course, motivated a great deal of effort on the other side. The second reason for this success is that many of these countries had actually quite solid state structures. This had been captured by one-party rule for over 40 years, but the underlying institutional structures were quite capable. And they were able to adjust to the new challenges quite successfully. And the third factor, and I think it's almost the most important one, is that you had a huge cross-party consensus on the need to move towards the European Union. If you look back over these 15 years until these countries actually became members of the European Union, governments were thrown out in just about every election, because the population was very frustrated, angry and annoyed about the speed of reforms, the kind of cost of the loss of the security of the old system. So the people were angry and threw out every government. But the new government that came in pursued exactly the same policies based on the advice from Brussels. Because the consensus was across from the post-communist parties to the liberal parties to the more nationalist parties, everybody agreed on these objectives. And this continuity and discipline which came from this process assured the final success. Now, I don't want to paint a too rosy picture. I think communism left rather harsh legacy. It destroyed much of the social fabric of these societies, and some of these wounds will take generations to heal. But altogether, it definitely was a huge success. Now, the second part of this Eastern European enlargement, Romania and Bulgaria, was less happy and I must say less successful. Many people believe that these countries were not sufficiently prepared. They continue to have big issues with governance, corruption, etc. So there is a widespread impression in Europe that maybe accession came too early for these countries. And shortly afterwards, of course, somehow the political support for enlargement plummeted in the European Union. And the main factor for this was, of course, the economic crisis. When the house is burning, it's not a good time to add another roof to it, was the case, to put it very simply. And the majority of the European population today is against further enlargement. And President Juncker, the new president of the Commission, has taken this on board, and he said, during the next 5 years, there will be no further accessions. Very negative message to the countries that are still waiting to move in this direction. But of course, the enlargement process as such is not stopped. There are currently 8 countries who have the promise of accession of the EU. There is Turkey, where the negotiations are essentially deadlocked. There is Iceland, which has frozen the enlargement process from its side. And then there are the 6 Balkan countries, and that's where most of the focus of the work is right now. The Balkans have been promised accession in 2003 at the summit in Thessaloniki. But the process is very, very slow and very complicated. One country has made it so far. Croatia joined last year, in 2013. The EU is negotiating with 2 countries, with Serbia and Montenegro, and all the other countries are still further behind in the process. Why is it so complicated and difficult? Because the special factors that made it such a success in Central Europe are not there. State structures are much weaker. You know, these countries have the old same legacy of the decentralized Ottoman empire that you have in the Arab world. Some of them at least, so far less capable of institutions. Then you don't have the same kind of consensus on the EU. Everybody's paying lip service because it continues to be very popular in the population, but you have rent-seeking elites that are very ambivalent of really joining the European Union and not committed to genuine reforms. And the third factor is you have the legacy of conflict. So you continue to have big tensions between various states. You have still not fully resolved status issues such as Kosovo. You have very dysfunctional structures in Bosnia-Herzegovina. So big handicaps on the way to Europe. Still, I would say, altogether, I remain optimistic for these countries, because basically there is no alternative. These countries are now an enclave within the European Union. Wherever they turn and look, there is the EU. They're already integrated in terms of trade, more than 60% in the EU, and they see no really alternative to eventually joining the European integration. And the EU, for its part, is so invested in these countries and so exposed to trouble coming from them that it also will continue on the way to enlargement. I think with luck, Serbia and Montenegro might join in 2020, 2021. The other countries maybe 5-10 years later, but eventually I think all of the countries that really want to join will eventually become members of the European Union. Finally, another group of countries that has been long neglected but is now receiving a lot more attention. These are the countries of the Eastern Partnership, Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, Armenia and Azerbaijan. These countries have an offer which is based, the Eastern Partnership was launched in 2008, but it's based on the European Neighbourhood Policy, which was launched in 2004, and also applies, of course, to the South. This offer is rather similar. The idea is to support democracy, rule of law, political reforms, to support economic development and overall stable environment, but there is, and the instruments and methods are also very similar to the enlargement process. There are the annual reports, there are action plans with reforms, there is the conditionality. In 2011 it was formulated the more for more. The more a country is doing in the reform area, the more support will it receive from the European Union. I think altogether this policy has not been hugely successful. There are two big different factors that are making it very complicated. The one is it is a diluted form of enlargement, basically. The chief carrot membership is lacking, and therefore the motivation of actually doing painful reforms is not there to the same extent. This is the first factor, and the second factor is Russia, basically. Different from Central Europe, the EU is not the only show in town. And the EU's position has been that if these countries reform and develop economically, this is not directed against anyone. Certainly not against Russia. Moscow should also benefit from a positive development of these countries. But Mr. Putin sees this very differently. He sees it in terms of a zero-sum game, that every step that these countries do towards the European Union makes the zone of influence that he wants to establish in the region weaker. And therefore he, from the beginning, very much fought against the Eastern Partnership and tried to make it as difficult as possible. So far the record is not very good, frankly. Belarus was an authoritarian regime at the beginning. It's subject to EU sanctions. Nothing much has changed. Azerbaijan is a fairly authoritarian regime. It has a lot of oil wealth. Its geopolitical orientation is elsewhere. It is not hugely interested in the EU offer. Armenia is sort of in between. It would like to be more European, but is very dependent in terms of security on Russia, which limits its potential of moving in this direction. So there are basically two success stories, and that is Moldova and Georgia, countries that are Western-oriented on the reform course and benefit from the offer of the EU. And the most interesting question is, of course, the Ukraine. Now, Mr. Yanukovych was a very corrupt and fairly authoritarian ruler, but he was interested in the EU offer as a counterbalancing move to its Russian pressure. So when the EU negotiated the association agreement, Mr. Yanukovych seemed quite interested in signing it. And when the EU said, well, we need certain judicial reforms, you have to release Madame Tymoshenko, who was in prison, he seemed to be ready to move in this direction. But then Mr. Putin put trade sanctions on the Ukraine. He threatened to raise the energy prices. Eventually the pressure was such that Mr. Yanukovych caved in and said he's abandoning the hope of signing the agreement. So this looked like game, set and match for Mr. Putin. But of course he had underestimated the soft power of the European Union, because a major part of the Ukrainian population much preferred the European path towards modernization than Mr. Putin's offer. So you had the Maidan movement, mass movement for several months. It kept on the pressure, and eventually waving the blue EU flag, it brought down the Yanukovych government. Well, this was not part of the EU game plan, definitely not. The EU is everybody who knows anything about the EU knows this. It's totally incapable of launching any kind of mass movement of that sort. But what has looked like a huge disaster for the European Union has turned now into a huge disaster for Vladimir Putin. And he was prompted into counter-escalating by taking over the Crimea and by invading and supporting the rebels in eastern Ukraine. And that has changed the picture enormously. Most of all, in terms of supporting Ukraine, it has upped the ante. This is now taking place in the context of a geopolitical struggle between the EU and Russia, which the EU cannot really afford to lose. So I think so far the EU has responded rather impressively in terms of massive economic assistance, more than 11 billion to the Ukraine, in terms of unilateral trade concessions, in terms of putting together sanctions against Russia to deter further aggression. And also it has taken a much more hands-on approach in supporting political reforms. There is now the support group of the Commission that has large teams working with the various ministries in Kiev, trying to put together a reform agenda. There is, since a few days, there is also a rule of law mission from the member states in Kiev to advise on security sector reform. So altogether this engagement is fairly impressive, but the question is that is it sufficient? Because Mr. Putin will not give up quickly, the pressure will continue. Some people say he cares a lot more about losing Ukraine than the EU cares about gaining it. So the question is, does the EU have sort of the sustaining the power to continue to keep its focus and to do what is necessary to make this a success? And that also applies to Moldova and Georgia, which are also under quite severe Russian pressure. Finally, just a few words on what this all means for the Arab countries. I think the real success story, the membership building, basically, member state building process of enlargement is not applicable, because Morocco has applied for membership in the European Union, but the European Union has said no. The treaty said only European countries can become EU members. So membership is not really an option. So what is on offer to the Arab states is very similar to what is in offer on the Eastern Partnership countries. That means and this incentive, you talked about the market access, financial support and mobility. These are the right topics, but these are topics as issues on which the EU is not prepared to offer a great deal. In terms of, the fear of migration is huge. The readiness to make big trade concessions on Mediterranean agriculture is not really there either. And in terms of financial support, also there are players like Qatar and Saudi Arabia who have a lot more money to really deploy on this issue. So I think basically if you talk to officials in Brussels, they would say it has worked reasonably well with Tunisia. I think we can say Morocco is doing also, is benefiting from this offer. Otherwise the record is quite unsatisfactory. By and large, the EU has been a bystander throughout the Arab Spring and the following developments. It did not have policies, it did not have an approach that really counted, that is really relevant. So Mr. Juncker has given Mr. Hahn, who is the new commissioner working on this issue, instructions to reform the neighborhood policy, to make it more relevant. So this will be a process that lasts at least a year. So if you have good ideas on how the EU can get its act together and become a more relevant player in this region, now is the time to go to Brussels and explain. Thank you.